Шановні колеги, ми продовжуємо заслуховувати попередні звіти, попередні результати міжнародних моніторингових місій.
So we continue to listen to the results of the observations and Raynell Andreychuk, head of mission, Senator, Parliament of Canada. She's the head of Canadian mission of observers, is ready to present the results of the observation mission.
Of Canadian Parliament. Ms. Andreychuk will present its interim report of the Canadian election observation missions on Ukraine early parliamentary elections. Without any further ado, Senator, you're welcome.
Good afternoon. Bonjour. Добрий день. It's a pleasure for me to speak to you today on behalf of the Canadian Election Observation Mission. The parliamentary election in Ukraine, held yesterday, has met, in our opinion, international democratic standards. Despite the Russian occupation of Crimea and continuing destabilization in parts of Ukraine, a majority of the Ukrainian people have freely exercised their democratic right to vote. Our mission deployed observers to every region of the country, except, of course, occupied Crimea, where no elections were to take place. In fact, we were the only international mission that had long-term observers based in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Despite continued destabilization in parts of these regions, the voters had access to many polling stations that were located under the control of the government of Ukraine. The CANEOM mission deployed long-term observers to areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts under control of the Ukrainian National Forces to gather information and observe efforts by election commissions, security agencies, and regional administrators to establish conditions for the conduct of secure elections. They assessed that the security environment in areas they visited had normalized in comparison to May 2014, the presidential election, when armed militants were observed forcefully shutting down administrative buildings and engaging in violence against election commissioners. I must mention that because of the illegal occupation of Crimea and the destabilization of parts of the Donbass region by Russian-backed extremist elements, more than 4 million Ukrainian citizens were deprived of the right to vote on Sunday. On behalf of our mission, I commend the people of Ukraine who voted in this election, often under difficult circumstances. The overall campaign in Ukraine took place in accordance with international and domestic electoral laws. Yes, there were irregularities in this election. For example, isolated incidents of violence, intimidation, and attempts to buy votes. However, I stress that there is nothing that we observed to show systemic irregularities in this election, and I am proud to report that this election was a substantial improvement over the parliamentary election in 2012, which we observed, when significant irregularities were recorded throughout the campaign leading up to and on the election day. The same was not in this election. The 2014 campaign environment was characterized by a broad plurality of political parties and electoral actors. There was no shortage of choice. The current crisis facing the country had a material impact on the campaign, increasing its intensity, importance, and, I must say, the rhetoric of campaign participants. One of the features of the election campaign was the presence of civil society activists as candidates. Particularly prominent on party lists were Euromaidan activists and journalists. They joined several of the parties, stating that their goal was to advance the reforms that they believe the country needs through the political process. Additionally, there was a significant improvement in how authorities dealt with the violations of the electoral law, and we found this to be significant. When problems of this kind were reported by observers, the law was generally enforced and upheld by the authorities. This is a fundamental shift in the state, ensuring conduct of free and fair elections. Our long-term observers monitored preparations for the administration of elections through visits to every oblast across Ukraine, except, of course, occupied Crimea and Sevastopol. District electoral commissions, DECs or ridings as we call them at home in Canada, were generally observed to be functioning in a transparent and cohesive manner and to meet deadlines despite the shortened electoral calendar. Few DECs outside of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts had difficulties achieving quorum in spite of frequent changes to their membership. In conclusion, I would like to highlight CANEOM's three main observations in this preliminary report. Number one, our assessment shows that the democratic will of the people is reflected in these results in accordance with the laws of Ukraine, international law, and international standards. Number two, there were new challenges in this election as compared to the last parliamentary election in 2012, such as access to voting in conflict-affected parts of the country and occupied Crimea of the country, a large number of internally displaced people, and of course safety and security concerns, particularly near the conflict zone. Number three, the authorities generally enforce the electoral law when faced with violations. In fact, additional special measures were put in place by various government departments to enhance enforceability. Last but not least, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to our observers in CANEOM for doing an excellent job in monitoring over 3,000 polling stations and 93% of electoral districts in which our elections were held. My thanks also to the Government of Canada for its support and funding of this mission, and for its unwavering support for the people of Ukraine and the democratic process in this country. Our mission appreciates the cooperation and support of the phenomenal staff of our embassy here in Kiev, and my appreciation also to the multiple government officials from the Central Electoral Commission and various ministries and agencies. Дуже дякую. But this is really about the people of Ukraine, who continue to insist that no degree of adversity or malice will stand in their way of exercising their democratic rights and love of freedom. I would be happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Ms. Senator. Чи є в нас запитання, колеги?
Any questions, dear colleagues?
Then, if you permit, since your mission had almost an exclusive and unique opportunity to observe the election in the most problematic region in eastern Ukraine, can you be more specific in terms of the elections in that areas? Do you believe that the people still had this freedom of choice and there was no shortage of choice and the people could really be could participate normally in the elections?
Well, I think we'll have to deal with more of that in our final report because we're still assessing that. What was so different from I should say the presidential, when there was no ability to get to some polling stations, even though the government tried to open them. And I guess what the presidential election to now pointed out in Luhansk and in Donetsk was the fact that people could get to the polls, that there was that measure of security in the areas that were there, so they could at least make it. Before they were trying to make it to the polls, of course, and there was intimidation, and some polls just couldn't open. So I think we'll have to assess whether there were sufficient choices there, but they made it to the polls. They made it in sufficient numbers that their input is valuable. I have said before, and I will say here, that those people, the 4 million that couldn't get there, it will then not be an election issue, but a political issue for the government to deal with how to include them in the future development of Ukraine. But it appeared that there was a desire to get to the polls, and the reason that people couldn't vote was not because of the government and not because of the Electoral Commission. It was because of outside forces. So to the extent that the government of Ukraine could control those areas and could provide a free and fair election, we feel they did that. So the reasons that people couldn't get to the poll was not in the hands of the government of Ukraine.
What are the piece of advice that you would like to give to the future government and the newly fresh elected politicians of Ukraine?
Perhaps my own personal advice, and I'm not speaking for the government because the ambassador is sitting there who speaks for the government. I've come to Ukraine since its independence almost consistently, and I would just encourage all of the candidates, all of the parties, to now work together and to start the reforms that are absolutely necessary to continue to secure this country, to reclaim the sovereign territory of Ukraine, and I believe Canadians will stand with them.
We appreciate a lot the support of the Canadian government and your personal visit to Ukraine Crisis Media Center to announce the results. Thank you so much. Якщо у нас немає запитань, thank you again. And our next press briefing is according to the time schedule. Thank you so much.
Thank you.